Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to this meeting of Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. We're obviously meeting by virtual means as a result of government restrictions at the minute. So while we're doing that, could you make sure that you turn your camera off, and this helps improve the connection? Can you leave your microphone muted? And this is really important for minimizing background noise. And during the talk, you'll be aware of the chat function at the bottom. Please do make comments or ask questions, and what we'll do is we'll use them for the end of the meeting. And if you are tweeting, please use our hashtag #EdBibSoc. Be great if you could do that. And please note that the audio part of this talk will be recorded. I think you've already probably had a button to press to acknowledge that. So just to say, the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society promotes the study of books and manuscripts of any date, particularly Scottish, and that's through our meetings, publications and other activities. We were founded in 1890, and as such we're the oldest such society in the world and the only extant one with a Scottish focus. You can find out more about our events programme, our journal and occasional publications on our website. Tonight, I would like to welcome our speaker, Tom Harrison. Good, glad to see. Welcome, Tom. I'm glad to see you. You're back at your seat. There, he's a lecturer in early modern literature at Queen's University, Belfast. He's interested in early modern and classical theatre, with a particular focus on the reception of Greek and Latin in the work of Ben Jonson. He's currently finishing finalising a monograph for Routledge, provisionally titled Classical Imitation and Contamination in the Comedies of Ben Jonson. In 2020, he held a library fellowship at the University of Edinburgh, where he also worked as a teaching fellow in the School of English. His library project on the manuscript material of the Halliwell-Phillips collection will be the subject of this talk today. And you might know that James Orchard Halliwell-Phillips was one of the eminent Shakespearean scholars of the 19th century, renowned for his encyclopaedic knowledge of Shakespeare's life and times, his meticulous attention to detail about his subject, and his library, which included hundreds of rare and unique items of Shakespeareana. He was also accused of theft, of scholarly incompetence, and perhaps worst of all, of mutilating countless early modern texts, cutting them up and pasting them in many scrapbooks that aided his researches. So who was Halliwell-Phillips? Literary archaeologist or Victorian vandal? This talk will explore the life and work of the Shakespearean antiquary with reference to his collection of printed and manuscript material that he has bequeathed to Edinburgh University Library. The story of the collection's arrival, its contents, and some of the surprises that lie within, that all contribute a fuller and more nuanced picture of the Halliwell-Phillips working practice, his approach to his material, and the reverence he held for Shakespeare, the man he termed the great dramatist. Tom, over to you.
Thanks so much, Heather. Can I just check? Could you give us a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Excellent, good, right. If at any point my audio cuts out, please someone warn me. That'd be great. I'm always paranoid about these online deliveries. Anyway, thank you very much. Welcome to my talk. And thanks once again, Heather, for that very nice introduction. So, as has been mentioned, this talk will cover some of the things I've learnt about Halliwell-Phillips and his collection during my library fellowship in 2020. And I'm aware of the experience, the vast experience in this virtual room, and I'd be extremely grateful for any comments about my methodology or conclusions, some of the conclusions that I've made in this project, and ideas that I'm continuing to form, because as was mentioned in the introduction, my background is not in archive work, but more in early modern theatre. So I'm very much learning on the go with this project. So before we get to the collection itself, a little bit about James Orchard Halliwell-Phillips. He was Cambridge educated, although he didn't end up taking a degree. And he spent most of his time at Cambridge as a student working in the college libraries, and was even granted extraordinary access to the collections. And by this point, book collecting mania and book documenting mania had already set in for him. He was the youngest ever fellow of the Royal Society and was involved heavily with the Shakespeare Society, the Percy Society, and involved in a host of other national and international societies from a very, very young age. He was born Halliwell, but took the name Halliwell-Phillips following his marriage to Henrietta Phillips, the daughter of the well-known antiquarian Thomas Phillips. Relations between father and son-in-law would remain acrimonious until Thomas Phillips' death. And Phillips famously granted everyone permission to visit his collection of early modern material, except Halliwell, his daughter, and all Roman Catholics. One of the ironies of the archive at Edinburgh is that it is known as the Halliwell-Phillips collection, although a letter that accompanied the original bequest states, I've got it there, I should much prefer, at the risk of the imputation of a small literary vanity, that my former name be retained in everything connected with the collection. So in the spirit of this request, and also to save a little bit of time, I will therefore refer to Halliwell-Phillips as Halliwell through the rest of the talk. And Halliwell had an incredible output that numbered hundreds of publications by his death. These publications included works of biography, editions of rare texts, dictionaries, and much, much more. Many of these works he published privately, and he seems to have had an eye on exclusivity rather than profit in many instances. So his print runs were extremely low in number, and he seemed had this peculiar habit of printing, for example, 25 copies of something and then destroying 10 of them before releasing the others for sale. Undoubtedly, though, his knowledge allowed him to make some profits through his book collections, portions of which he occasionally had to sell. So despite Halliwell's own claims, a tension between scholarly activity and commercial interest would continue through his life. And he became increasingly interested in the work, life, and times of Shakespeare. His first substantial publication was in 1848, The Life of William Shakespeare. But then it was followed with a 16-volume Shakespeare edition between 1853 to 65, limited to 150 copies, as was his usual practice. And he's best known today for his illustrations and outlines of the life of Shakespeare. These two works showcase the best of Halliwell's work: meticulous, attentive to fine detail that can be gleaned from the records, alert to aspects of Shakespeare's life in London or Stratford that may seem superfluous to many, but help to build up a more rounded picture of a figure who is notoriously difficult to pin down in the documentary records. Halliwell has been styled as a literary archaeologist. His contributions to knowledge on Shakespeare's life include the discovery of hitherto unknown documents, including the earliest known reference from 1594 of Shakespeare as a player. He also uncovered many further details about Shakespeare's business dealings in Stratford and London, and on details on his wider family. One biographer has described such findings as uniformly unspectacular, which is perhaps a fair assessment. One does not get particularly excited, for instance, to find out that Shakespeare was paid 10 pence for a load of stone in 1598. But even today, documentary information about Shakespeare does not extend much beyond a few appearances in legal documents, contemporary references to him by fellow writers, and later anecdotal accounts, many of which are highly unreliable. In the context of Shakespeare's continuing enigmatic documentary presence, Halliwell's findings are a significant achievement. Aside from those achievements, Halliwell was a figure of notoriety in some circles. There was a scandal in 1845 when a bookseller sold 11 manuscripts of Halliwell's old books to the British Museum. And it was discovered that some of these items had been abstracted, and for abstracted we can read stolen, from the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, where Halliwell had spent time as an undergraduate. Halliwell had his reading privileges revoked from the British Library, and his struggles to clear his name went on for several years. The spat was conducted in public, with national newspapers and journals used as fora for both parties to air their views. And as we'll see shortly, Halliwell made use of the trial by public approach to airing grievances for the rest of his life. Ultimately, there was not enough evidence for anyone to say conclusively that Halliwell had stolen the manuscripts. There were problems with both sides of the argument. The college librarians produced contradictory statements about the manuscripts and Halliwell's access to them. And although Halliwell always maintained that he'd bought the manuscripts from someone else, it's suspicious that for a man normally so meticulous with his record keeping, that he had no record of their provenance. But with no firm evidence, the British Library returned his reading privileges in 1846. But this would not be the only black mark against Halliwell as a scholar. From his precocious works, including a text wonderfully called A Few Hints to Novices in Manuscript Literature, written when he was aged 19, he never fully escaped the charge of dilettantism. And it's hard not to agree with this position when one looks at the range and sheer volume of his output, which aside from works on Shakespeare include numerous editions of old texts and plays, a dictionary of archaic and provincial words, a text on the early history of Freemasonry in England, a book of popular rhymes and nursery tales, and a collected edition of the letters of the kings of England. In his younger days, he was accused of careless work in places, especially with his editing, and he was not well regarded in the field of literary criticism. Add to this another habit that appalls many a modern bibliophile. Halliwell used many of the old books that came into his possession as raw material for his researches, and would cut out whatever he saw as useful, discarding the rest of the text or leaving it mutilated. A visitor to Halliwell's Brighton home refers to, have I got it here? I believe so. Oh no, that's the next bit. He refers to a waste paper bin. Yes, sorry. A visitor to Halliwell's Brighton home refers to a waste paper bin, 12 feet long and 3 feet wide, and nearly full of fragments, just outside his workroom. And there are also reports that even by the end of his life, and I'm quoting here, he still had agents employed all over the country, men who spent all their time peering into waste paper baskets, old town records, and musty garrets where they sometimes made great discoveries. And there are even claims of Halliwell buying texts from booksellers, ripping out the section he needed, and then discarding the rest. Schoenbaum, who is one of Halliwell's biographers, attests that there is a streak of larceny that runs through his character, and a quotation from E.V. Lucas attests to this idea that Halliwell himself wasn't averse to saying that he would take bits from text that he didn't mind having in his own possession. So what I chiefly remember in this meeting with Halliwell is his remark that if he ever chanced to see anything in anyone else's house or in a museum that he thought he was more worthy to possess and obviously more able to protect than its owner, he had no scruples about taking it. This may have been a humorous and idle boast, but he said it. An article for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust breathlessly refers to Halliwell as the book world's Jekyll and Hyde, saving old books from oblivion by day while tearing others apart by night. And although the association seems a little overdone, it's difficult to square his antiquarian aims with the bibliographic standards of today. And other contemporaries had equally awful things to say about him. He is a puerile blockhead, aiming at everything and able to do nothing. And if ever man deserved transportation, I believe H does. All of this paints a rather bleak picture of Halliwell, but the fact remains that at his death, he was one of the most well-respected Shakespearean scholars in the Anglophone world. Some may have viewed him askance for the British Museum incident, but in terms of his collecting habits, he does not appear to have been unusual to his contemporaries. In a time where research materials were not available at the click of a button, the cutting up of texts and remounting them in notebooks was often the only way for those working on large-scale projects to keep any sort of control over their material. And there are accounts of the compilers of the Oxford English Dictionary doing something very similar, with contributors sometimes posting fragments of rare black letter texts along with their entries for individual words. Professional issues aside, Halliwell appears to have been a likeable character, a family man, genial and generous with those he was friendly with and those who had a similar love for Shakespeare. And he was also conscientious and ready to defend himself and his friends against perceived slights. His work required good relations with a wide variety of individuals and institutions in and beyond Britain, as it needed assistance with accessing records, answering questions, and the success of his endeavours indicates that he was probably not the complete rogue that his enemies indicated. So one of Halliwell's real skills was his ability to establish and cultivate working relationships with a wide array of scholars and collectors, who frequently gave him opportunity to access materials unavailable to many others. One such fruitful relationship was with David Lang, the renowned antiquary and librarian of the Signet Library in Edinburgh. Lang had been instrumental in loaning Edinburgh Library's rare 1600 copy of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus so that Halliwell could make a facsimile. Halliwell did not forget this kindness, and several years later, he contacted Lang to ask which library was the best in Scotland for collecting and preserving a significant archive. The upshot was that Halliwell bequeathed a large collection of his books and working books to the library in 1872, with the bulk of the materials arriving between that year and the scholar's death in 1889. And a second Halliwellian collection of mainly restoration quartos, which was originally gifted to the Penzance Library, was to be purchased in 1964. Letters that Halliwell sent to and from Edinburgh in the lead up to the bequest reveal a man who was conscious of the value of his collection and careful for his own legacy. In this opening letter, he assures Lang that his library is exclusively Shakespearean, small, but it is choice and select, no rubbish. Once the bequest was underway, Halliwell began to send deliveries of his collection up to Edinburgh, always by rail rather than boat, as he was fearful of his treasures being lost at sea, like something from a Shakespearean romance. His care is revealed in the recorded delivery he opts for, and his anxious request for notifications of safe arrival. A few months later, he would write another letter to John Small, a university librarian, who by this point had become, I believe, rather beleaguered with letters from Halliwell. And Halliwell in this letter requested that his Shakespearean pieces not be mixed with literary curiosities of another kind, and that Shakespeare should have, quoting, a compartment entirely to himself to preserve their charm. So the collection that Halliwell bequeathed runs to hundreds of print items, amongst which are approximately 100 manuscript books from Halliwell's notes, which include volume after volume of notes, memoranda, drafts of work, and so on. My project focused on the 30 manuscript items that have been identified as containing fragments of early print. And in the library's original survey of these materials, early print was defined as pre-1800, so I stuck with that categorization in my own work. And my project mainly focused on identifying and cataloguing these fragments in the hope that we may be able to identify the origin of some of his clippings. As one commentator has said, the manuscript collection reveals the activities of the scholar and bookman working with his sleeves rolled up. The collection includes memoranda on Shakespeare's plays, numerous notes and scrapbooks covering subjects as diverse as record office holdings, the history and antiquities connected to people, places and things associated with Shakespeare's life and work, and details of Shakespeare's family members. Also included are draft copies of some of his major works, including the illustrations and the outlines, and curious items like 2 volumes of William Island's forged documents. Many of the details found within his notebooks have been superseded by large modern archival projects like the records of early English drama, but there are still surprising elements. Halliwell was eager for his collection to be of use to later generations of Shakespeare students, and more than one volume assures its readers that although its contents can now be found in print, the manuscript version contains details that may be used to settle, and I'm quoting again, any questions of authenticity. He even seems concerned about the physical welfare for future researchers, as attested by a lone note on a page of his notebook on the Oxford records. There is no doubt whatever that Oxford is a most desperate place for typhoid fever. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you a few of the curiosities of the collection. Curiosities was a favourite word of Halliwell, so I think it's appropriate to use it here. Here's a couple of photos from the Shakespearean forgeries of William Island. Island was famous for producing a raft of documents supposedly connected to or produced by Shakespeare himself, I think in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And the edition that is, or the 2 volumes that are in the library here, appear to be the original forgeries, if original forgeries makes any sense at all. It's a really interesting document and includes some particular standout material, like this witty conundrum of Shakespeare on the left and a lock of Shakespeare's hair on the right. Who knows where that came from? In the literary scraps book that I paid particular attention to, he's often included cutouts from maps. So this is possibly from Brown and Hogenberg's Civitatis Orbis Terrarum of 1572, which may horrify some map enthusiasts out there. I don't know a lot about maps myself, but it did make me start when I came across these, I can tell you. He was also not limited just to material to do with Shakespeare in his time. He was also interested in the Shakespearean afterlife. So this is a detail, I think, of the I can't see my note at the bottom, but the I think it was one of the celebrations at Stratford, the Shakespeare Jubilee, which was a disaster according to Halliwell. And also as well, something that we encounter in some of the manuscript materials are bits of old text that seems to have been marked up for reproduction in his own edition. So this is a section from Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, which has been marked up for modern spelling, and a note at the top reads, all small type, no black letter. An interesting instance of how, in the process of making items accessible for a wider readership, Halliwell is destroying, obscuring the original material that he's working with. So in my project, I paid close attention to the 5 books of Halliwell's literary scraps that are in the collection, which have some of the highest concentration of textual fragments and have a roughly logical order to them, although this is not maintained throughout. Volume 3 of the literary scraps, for instance, is almost entirely filled with draft correspondence concerning a notorious fallout Halliwell had with the Stratford Town Council in the 1880s concerning his work with some of the corporation's manuscripts. In typical style, Halliwell had removed some important documents from their storeroom in order that facsimiles might be made, and his doing this without the express authority of the council was described as irregular by one of its members, a local brewer named Mr. Charles Flower. This led to a very public disagreement, which included Halliwell printing a pamphlet of his correspondence with the council in an attempt to clear his name and sully theirs. And the result was an acrimonious split with the town with which he'd been so long associated. Even in a volume that seems to be largely focused on one topic, We find Halliwell toing and froing with his letters to various members of the council, intercut with comments on Shakespeare's compositional habits, his education, and the original performance condition for his plays. And this is something that runs through the literary scraps as a whole range, that there seems to be some order to the focus that he's giving, and then it cuts away to something else and then goes back to the original topic without apparent rhyme or reason. And here are some of the interesting curiosities, again, that I found within some of these scrapbooks. Many of the manuscript fragments pasted in are notes or parts of drafts that Halliwell had written himself. Some of them are copies of Shakespearean documents, not all of them apparently in Halliwell's own hand. A shock awaited me in volume 1 with a manuscript of a document referring to William Kemp, Shakespeare and Burbage. And I thought he couldn't possibly have stolen this from somewhere and pasted it in. But this turned out to be a facsimile of the original document completed by a Mr. Ashby, who Halliwell collaborated with on several facsimile projects. Ashby wouldn't be the only additional contributor to the literary scraps that I'd find. On occasion, hands appear that are not his own. Are they evidence of the mysterious agents that I mentioned earlier that Halliwell supposedly had rooting in bins and libraries up and down the country? Or, an equally intriguing prospect, are they the work of his first and second wives and his daughters, all of whom assisted his studies through copying and collating documents? This is a question that is probably unanswerable now, but stands as an interesting reminder of the hidden labours and labourers that lie behind the sort of all-consuming, comprehensive work that Halliwell was attempting. And the volumes frequently intersperse writing in Halliwell's own hand with fragments of text, both pre and post 1800. The loose order that seems to continue with Halliwell's notes in these volumes is completely jettisoned with the fragments. Aside from the occasional instance, Halliwell seems to have pasted these fragments into his book without rhyme or reason. Many of the fragments have been pasted into the verso sheets in the scrapbook, which makes me wonder whether some of the fragments were a later addition, some sort of attempt later on in life, presumably, of Halliwell trying to get some order to his huge collection of literary fragments by pasting them somewhere. The most frequent text to appear in the scrapbooks is Robert Allett's 1600 anthology of poetry extracts called England's Parnassus, of which I've counted 98 pages across all 5 volumes. Halliwell's interest in this text is exclusively Shakespearean, so he's careful to note the origin of the quotations he finds within the collection, whether that be Richard II, Richard III, RJ for Romeo and Juliet, or simply P for the narrative poems. Curiously, Halliwell had included a 1600 edition of England's Parnassus among some of the rarities in his collection in a pamphlet for visitors to that same collection. And bibliophile hearts may sink at the news that a copy of the 1600 England's Parnassus was included with other auction items at Halliwell's death, with all but its introductory matter removed. Perhaps this is the same edition that's ended up taking pride of place in these scrapbooks, although it's worth noting that Halliwell had a duplicate of at least 1 page from this text, so who knows how many he was accessing. The habit of mining early print text for purely Shakespearean reasons continues with his use of plays. The Johnsonian in me was horrified to see an excerpt from the Induction to Bartholomew Fair and from Jonson's 1616 works, as well as similar shrifts being given to plays by Randolph, Middleton, Tate, Shadwell and Dekker, all of which have been pasted in with notes accompanying saying what their relevance was to Shakespeare. Johnson in particular would not have approved of this. These texts seem here to have been thought worthy of attention only for the passing references they give to Shakespeare, and the texts themselves are sometimes underlined or noted on, as you'll see in the examples shown there. And Halliwell's non-dramatic fragments fascinate in a different way, as they illustrate how far and wide Halliwell would cast his net for even the most tenuous reference to Shakespeare. He consults legal documents such as Bulstrode's reports, a German account of the Duke of Württemberg's journey to England in 1592, and even locates a passing reference to the Comedy of Errors in Poor Robin's Visions, a book from 1677. And my favourite of his scraps is from Hugh Platt's Delights for Ladies to adorn their persons, tables, closets and distillatories with beauties, banquets, perfumes and waters, read, practice and censure. What a title. And this book notes that the dogberry, the plant that gives its name to the foolish constable of Much Ado About Nothing, is an excellent plant for dyeing the hair yellow. How much that reveals about Shakespeare's play or his character, I don't know. But it certainly shows that Halliwell was broad-minded in what he would accept as evidence for his Shakespearean studies. It's noteworthy as well that one finds over a page dedicated to the information on the dogberry in Halliwell's edition of the play in 1855. So he was definitely doing something with this material. So to give you a bit of an idea about what I was doing during the project, the output that I produced, I identified the pre-1800 texts that the fragments originally belonged to through a combination of Googling, using early English books online, and making reference to the explanatory notes that Halliwell left in his books, some of which were more helpful than others. I then used the English short title catalogue to access a copy of the text on early English books online and checked the digitized versions of these texts to confirm which edition the text originally belonged to. And so for each of the scraps I found, I produced an entry that looked a bit like this. So this is intended mainly for the benefit of future researchers and includes citation numbers so that people can find the ESTC entry if they would like. With some text, this task was pretty easy. The Decker text that's included here was fairly straightforward, as it only has one extant edition. So it didn't take long to find it on the ESTC or in early English books online. Others, especially texts that had near identical editions or little to no guiding evidence on the page, took a bit more time. And on occasion, I had to settle for offering a range of options for specific editions. So to give you an example of a particularly challenging one, England's Parnassus exists in 4 distinct editions, and it wasn't clear in many cases which one that belongs to, because the text is more or less identical in many examples. By the end of the work, I had a clearer sense of the range of Halliwell's scrap collections. The books contained approximately 176 individual fragments from 79 different texts, written by 46 different writers. And I've put approximately here because there were a couple of items that resisted complete identification. The most popular text by far was Robert Allot's Parnassus, which accounted for nearly a third of the total text that I found. The type of text that Halliwell drew on were very broad. As might be expected, plays were prominent, but there were also clippings from religious works, poetic anthologies, geographical and historical works, literary criticism, legal reports, and equestrian and domestic manuals as well. And there's just a few examples there on the screen. Ascribing value to a text based on its rarity is a crude metric, and in fact none of the fragments belong to texts that are plentiful in comparison to modern works. However, many of the texts that Halliwell collected have a reasonably healthy number of copies in existence, housed in various libraries and collections around the world. The average number seems to be about 30 for many of these texts. With copies of Holinshed's Chronicles, one of the most culturally significant of the fragments, being especially abundant. The fragments that belong to a much rarer collection of texts include Delony's Garland of Goodwill, Platt's Delights for Ladies, and Rowley's play When You See Me, You Know Me. What I've been unable to discover is how many of these fragments belong to previously intact copies, and how many may have existed in a damaged or fragmentary state. It brings to mind that 12-foot by 3-foot waste paper bin at Hollingbury Copse, the location of Halliwell's study. And that bin is a literary butcher's bin into which the mutilated carcasses of rejected copies were apparently thrown. I think of it with a shudder sometimes. So that was the overview of most of the discoveries I made. One of the things I was most looking forward to with this archival research was the thrill of uncovering something novel or unexpected. My exploration of Halliwell's manuscripts, and the working books in particular, had certainly led me to uncover lots of interesting details about Halliwell's working practices, although a lot of what I found confirms what I'd read in his biographies, that he cast his net far and wide in search of reference to Shakespeare or his works, and that he was willing to accept the most obscure allusion or trivial fact in his hunt for details in the man he termed the great dramatist. I enjoyed the puzzle of working out what the literary fragments were, trying to understand what their relevance was in the working books. But I must confess that few of these scraps seemed especially significant. Some in the virtual room may disagree. I'd love to hear more. None gave me the shock of discovery that I'd hoped. However, another thing that I've been told in preparation for this research was that the gods of the archive could produce something at the most unexpected of times. And this indeed was the case with me. The final fragment I examined was this page on the screen that gives the dramatis personae for Shakespeare's Timon of Athens. An underwhelming end to the project, I thought. I'd already come across Timon on several occasions during the research, particularly in a section from Shakespeare's Fourth Folio of 1685 and in Shadwell's restoration adaptation. And I did my usual checks, thinking that I would identify the text quickly enough by following the reference already completed. And as it turned out, the edition this fragment belongs to actually has the most extant copies of the text I'd examined, even more than Holinshed. There are 232 still known of this text in existence. In most scenarios, this fact would make the clipping the most unremarkable of the lot, except for one point. The fragment appears to be from a copy of Shakespeare's First Folio. So it's of, I am sure, no surprise to anyone here that the First Folio has a sacrosanct status amongst Shakespearean bibliophiles. Copies of this edition are highly sought after, with the Folger Library in Washington, which currently owns 82 copies, leading the charge in hoovering up the surviving versions of the text. The inclusion here of a fragment from the First Folio, which as far as I can tell is not a facsimile, was a genuine surprise. And more surprising still, as it was literally the last clipping I looked at. The chances of finding the exact copy of most of the other works of that Halliwell had cut up were fairly hopeless. And there's still a strong possibility that the leaf here may have belonged to a single sheet or a heavy mutilated copy of the text that Halliwell had acquired. I knew, though, that if Halliwell had taken the leaf from a more complete copy of the text, I had a reasonable chance of working out its origin. So using Rasmussen and West's descriptive catalogue of the extant First Folios, I discovered that there were 7 copies that had the relevant missing leaf, and tantalisingly, one of them had been in the ownership of the Stratford Library from 1862, at exactly the time when Halliwell was most associated with Stratford. Now, Halliwell never owned this copy, but he certainly knew of its existence. So is it possible that he took his scissors to a copy that was, relatively speaking, on his doorstep? A catalogue, there may be a more straightforward answer though. A catalogue of the auction of Halliwell's library in 1889 reveals that Halliwell had 3 copies of the First Folio at his death. 2 of these have not been recorded by Rasmussen and West and appear to have been imperfect. So imperfect, in fact, that perhaps one of these copies is the source of the mystery Timon page. another of HP's, sorry, I'm abbreviating now, another of Halliwell's notebooks in the Edinburgh collection that I looked at today records 2 copies of my folio Shakespeare to be cut up. Now, it's unclear whether this refers to the folios that Halliwell owned or whether the my folios refers to the works of Shakespeare that Halliwell himself produced as editor. Although it should be noted that this notebook, the notebook that I took the note from, contains other notes for early modern texts to be acquired and cut up in a similar fashion. The note is certainly ominous, as is the fact that it has been struck through with a single word "done" added to it. Ominous notes all round. So, as I mentioned previously, in a letter of 1872 to the Edinburgh University librarian, Halliwell had hoped, now that the first shipment had been safely received by the library, that he would gradually send the remainder, including my copy of the First Folio, under which someone, presumably Halliwell's addressee, had written First Folio, Shakespeare, underlined. The double underlining of that word Shakespeare betrays the interest that the First Folio generated even in the 19th century. And although the Halliwell collection contains fragments of the First Folio, including some very interesting separately bound playhouse copies of individual plays from the folio, Halliwell's hope of sending on a complete copy does not appear to have been realised. So the question is, where did the First Folio go? It seems likely that the First Folio being referred to is the near perfect copy that Halliwell referred to in his letter as being intended for the library. Perhaps Halliwell changed his mind about sending the folio on. Perhaps he forgot. Perhaps an unscrupulous or careless executor did not honour his wishes after his death. And it certainly appears from Halliwell's will that his executors did not follow all of his instructions. He left details concerning various institutions which were to receive parts of his library, but the quick auction of what appears to be most of the items indicates that these bequests were either declined by the institutions or ignored by the trustees, or the executors. We can't be sure, but what we do know is that the library, Edinburgh Library, may have lost the opportunity to acquire a priceless artifact that would have been the capstone of the Halliwell collection. There is, however, one final twist in the tale. The Halliwell folio was acquired not by the Edinburgh University Library, but by Mr. Charles Flower on behalf of the Shakespeare Memorial Library in Birmingham. Flower, you may recall, was the man who was largely responsible for Halliwell's dramatic split from Stratford in the 1870s, 1880s, following those accusations of irregular behaviour with the facsimile affair. There is a particular irony in the fact that the man with whom Halliwell had had such a bitter and public quarrel should be the person that acquired one of his most treasured possessions. There's a further irony in the fact that Mr. Charles Flower has his own claim to fame in Shakespearean circles. As a councilman, he'd taken a lead role in organising the tercentenary celebration of Shakespeare's birth in Stratford in 1864. And it was partly at his instigation that the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was built in Stratford, which would be the site of the, continues to be the site of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre that stands today. Flower deserves his own place in the history of Shakespeare's afterlife, although there is, of course, no acknowledgement of this in Halliwell's depiction of him as a local councilman getting in the way of scholarly work. As Feste says in Twelfth Night, thus the whirligig of time brings in his revenges. So this project threw up for me more conundrums and curiosities than I could have possibly managed in 3 months. But there are a few points about the scrapbooks that I can make. My impression is that the literary scraps live up to their name and that they are a haphazard collection of notes and fragments that have been pasted together. There is some consistency in the draft copy of Halliwell's own works, but the fragments do not appear to have any relation to them. At his death, Halliwell had hundreds of drawers in his study that were filled with thousands of clippings from texts, old and new, which he used as part of his researches. My view is that the fragments in these books were pasted there to help him give some order to his collection, which by the 1880s he acknowledged was too large for him to handle. The latest reliable date I found in the working books has been to July 1885, 4 years before Halliwell's death. The portion of the bequest that includes the manuscripts, or at least part of that portion, must have come to the library either just before or after Halliwell died, and not, as I first thought, as part of the initial delivery in 1872. Unfortunately, the University Library has records of the acquisition dates of the collection, but no details on what was delivered when, or at least I've not been able to find them so far. So narrowing it down to 1885 gives some clarity on when items may have arrived at Edinburgh. The wide range of the fragments and the fact that Halliwell appears to have been interested in them only for their Shakespearean connection, no matter how tenuous, does rather bear out the characterization of him as a man whose engagement with text was more that of an obsessive collector than a literary critic. This description is unlikely to have concerned Halliwell, though, for it was the assemblage of these thousands of details, all minuscule points on the map of Shakespeare's life, that brought his hero into sharpest relief. As Halliwell's biographer Marvin Spevak points out, Halliwell did not miss the forest for the trees. For him, the trees were the forest. It's clear too that whatever our views on Halliwell's cuttings are, he himself did not see his actions as problematic. Halliwell was conscious that his bequests were his legacy to the scholarly community, and his vigorous defence of himself across numerous professional spats showed that he was sensitive to accusations against his character. So would he leave lasting evidence of a supposed sharp practice? According to Halliwell, books that would now be considered rare were plentiful as blackberries to book collectors in his day. And maybe he and his fellow collectors did not realise the harm they were doing in cutting up their purchases. Perhaps these clippings belong to already mutilated or incomplete texts, so the pasted fragments are an act of preservation rather than destruction. The impression I get from my research is that Halliwell was a magpie for all things Shakespearean, making use of items old and new in his pursuit of Shakespeare and his life, without any filter on whether these materials are useful or not. And of course, the question of useful is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? The collection is a generous bequest of a lifetime's research for the Shakespeare scholars of the future. And his work is full of notes on the origin of quotes and ideas, as well as retractions and edits of his own thoughts. A note of Shakespeare's association with the Earl of Sussex men, for instance, is accompanied by a note in red ink. I changed my opinion afterwards, J-O-H-P. It's notable as well from his exchanges in volume 3 of the scrapbooks, how eager he was to take up the cudgels in defence of his reputation. His draft copy can sometimes be beautifully presented with hardly a correction to be found, but on other occasions his text is sometimes unreadable, full of deletions, additions and amendments. It's interesting to see what bits of writing also do not reach the stage of publication. So in his published letter to Stratford Council about that facsimile issue, Halliwell talks about the, I'm quoting again, serious financial risk necessarily incurred in the execution of publishing the Stratford facsimile documents, whereas a detailed section, a deleted section in his draft of the letter acknowledges the publication of the autotypes might, and I think would, if judiciously conducted, ultimately realise a profit. So it seems that even if we accept Halliwell's claim that he conducted many of his researches without hope of financial reward, he was at least aware that some of his work had a more obvious financial benefit than he let on in public. And indeed, this is another detail that emerges about Halliwell and his life. His antiquary work was animated by his book dealing, and the book dealing and antiquary work both point to an interest in making money as well as discoveries. Halliwell's material is as difficult to track down as his elusive subject. He was in the habit of selling and gifting parts of his collection throughout his lifetime, and Halliwell collections can be found not only at Edinburgh, but also at Stratford, University College London, and the Folger Library, which has the lion's share of the material. So at times, piecing together what the scrapbooks are has been a bit like trying to solve a huge jigsaw puzzle. There's half the pieces missing and no box. My explorations have revealed aspects of the man that seem wildly contradictory. At times, he seems like the avuncular man of the portrait on the left, bequeathing his collection in the hope that it will be of use to future scholars, and pointing the way to further research with helpful tips and explanations through his jottings and drafts. At others, he seems like the man on the right, the chaos and jumble of his notes indicative of a disordered mind, his cutting habits displaying a counterintuitive willingness to destroy while he preserved. And the most poignant example of this tendency is represented by the hundreds of fragments he pasted into his works. Gathered thus, they are preserved as records of Halliwell's researches, and their accompanying annotations signpost Shakespearean allusions to future scholars. But such signposting portrays these materials as only of interest because of their connections, sometimes very tenuous connections, to Shakespeare's works and life, and obscure all other points of interest that they may contain. Even more obviously, by choosing to highlight one side of a page, Halliwell has permanently hidden the other by pasting it into his scrapbook. So, to bring this to a conclusion, one of the most interesting observations about the Halliwell archive has been offered by Paul Salzman, who has examined several items in several of the collections now in different institutions. Salzman sees the Halliwell material as useful not only because they are remainders and reminders of a scholarly life, a subject of some interest in itself, but because it reveals the huge iceberg of knowledge submerged beneath the tip of Halliwell's published works. His papers are, according to Salzman, a kind of external archive that complements the published material, and the haphazard cutting and arranging of material is a sign of his accretive organisation of facts, his faith in the material basis of knowledge. Halliwell's published work show the result of his archaeological excavations, his poking around in the foundations of Shakespeare's history, but the collection gives us the tools to do our own digging. With the internet available to us at the click of a button, it's easy for us to forget today just how arduous scholarly researches must have been in the 19th century. Halliwell's collection is a Victorian search engine, a vast library that he imagined would aid the researches of future scholars, those he termed his successors. So I'll close with words from the man himself about one of his earlier editions of Shakespeare, which includes a quotation that lays out some of his attitudes perhaps most clearly. The works of Shakespeare should surely be surrounded, in one edition at least, by the reading of the student and the pencil of the archaeological draftsman. In one edition, let every source of useful illustration be explored and rendered accessible to the student and the future editor. And even if there be something redundant, much will remain suggestive of familiar explanations of obscurities and more popular uses. So, literary archaeologist, Victorian vandal, I think the jury's still out, but nonetheless, it was an interesting, it's an interesting life that Halliwell led and an interesting archive that he's left to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for that very interesting presentation. Yes, indeed, a Jekyll and Hyde. And I'm sure members of the audience would like to thank you as well. So we'll turn to some online questions that have been posted in the chat. And if anyone else wants to post some observations, comments, etc. in the chat, please feel free to do so. So we have, to start off with, we have Margaret Connolly making a comment, really interesting to hear of the help of Halliwell's wife and daughters. If the script is italic hand, that might be an indication that it was written by a woman. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, aside from saying that's really interesting, I'm going to make a note of that. Yes, that is a very interesting element. It's not something I must admit that I spent much time on, other than noting the possibility and moving on, because I was thinking about the fragments more than anything else. There are copies of Henrietta Phillips' diary in the collection that could quite easily be consulted to check that. There's the additional problem that, as I mentioned in the presentation, that it might have been Halliwell's second wife or his daughters that may have written that out. So it's not necessarily a question that could be conclusively answered by looking at the diary, and well, unless there's a match. If there isn't a match, it could well be another of Halliwell's female relatives. But the fact that italic script is indicative in some instances of a female hand, that's really useful. That might be something that I'll make use of in future. So thank you very much, Margaret. That's great.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Tom. Our next comment comes from Elizabeth Lawrence. Does that copy with the dramatic personae also lack any of the pages containing any of the other fragments of the First Folio which have been found in the collection?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, something I didn't mention, but as Elizabeth well knows, a discovery was made of the collected works of Shakespeare, a 19th century edition that includes fragments from the First Folio pasted in that was documented a number of years ago. It's not the same. That's not the same text. The copy that the scrapbook that I found that First Folio fragment in has other fragments from other texts, but no other First Folio fragments. It's the only, as far as I can tell, the only First Folio fragment in the scrapbooks that I looked at.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Elizabeth. We've got a comment from Joe Marshall. The collection also contains an imperfect copy of Shakespeare's 1610 poems, a book HP must have known was rare. Perhaps this one was a genuine rescue by modern standards.
So a genuine, what was that by modern standards? A
genuine rescue by modern standards.
Yeah, that again, that could well be the case. As I mentioned, it's really unclear where these many of these fragments came from. Even the First Folio fragments, I'm not really any closer to being able to say it was that copy that page belonged to. And it may well have been that Halliwell had access to severely mutilated, severely damaged copies that he rescued, in a sense, by pasting into the scrapbooks. And the Folger library, that, as I mentioned, has a very substantial collection of Halliwell-Phillips material. It includes a number of drawers of just scraps of old texts that clearly Halliwell hadn't got around to cataloguing or sorting, and they may well have a similar provenance. But with that in mind, balanced against that is some of the evidence from contemporaries that says no, he was quite used to cutting out bits of text. And actually, one of the items I was looking at today included references to there was a reference to Tarleton's Jests, which, as far as I'm aware, is a fairly rare text from 16th century that has the note "to be bought and cut up" next to it. So it was clearly something that he was doing. It's just to what extent was he doing that? But yes, absolutely right. It may well have been that in some instances he was preserving rather than destroying.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Joe. I have a request from one of our listeners to ask you to stop screen sharing at the minute.
All right.
So that,
yeah.
Our viewers can see you a bit clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we have a comment from Gianni Siegler. Are the scraps collected in the Edinburgh volumes given a subject heading for each volume? The 43 scrap boxes at the Folger, as well as the 55 balls, are organised by topic.
The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes, because the scrapbooks don't. They don't include a contents page or a note at the start saying this is what is contained within, but they are roughly organised. If you look at the material, it does seem to be ordered under rough rough topics. So as I mentioned, that volume 3, most of that volume 3 is taken up, the first part of it is taken up with this spat with Stratford Council, and then it moves on to another topic later on. And then in the earlier volumes, I think there's this is just off the top of my head, there are sections on Shakespeare's life and also sections on Shakespeare's relatives, but as I mentioned, it's very patchy. There are just moments where you'll get a page of text that seems to be he's marking up his own additions for revisions and so on, and he's pasted an older version of his text in, and he's marked it up alongside it. So they're a very strange collection, because it seems like it's a thought process type of thing where he's working through ideas and putting things in. And as I mentioned, the left hand side of the page seems to have been reserved mainly for pasting in fragments. So it seems like he was using the right hand side and then going back to the left when at a later date. But it is very confusing. I tried to make notes of what was on each page, but when I look over it, it is still a bit of a puzzle. So roughly speaking, there are some concentrations around certain topics in the scrapbooks, but they're no way uniform. I think the Folger has got the easier job in some ways of having much more uniform volumes at their disposal in their collection.
Thank you, Georgiana and Tom, for that one. A question from Helen Vincent. Do you think there would be a benefit to a digital reunification project to bring HP's collection together virtually from the various libraries which hold his books and scrapbooks, and or to relate his scraps out to linked items?
Yes, I do. I think that would be I think that would be beneficial, and it's something that I've thought about as a future project. Yes, so it would, yes, there'd definitely be a value to it, because it's not only the collection of the manuscript copies. It's not only of interest because it's a series of documents of a life, a scholarly life. So we're learning things about Halliwell-Phillips and also the working practices of antiquaries, bibliophiles in the 19th century. It's not only that, but it also contains thousands of items of trivia and little notes and observations, many of which I'm sure haven't made it into the published works, and many of which would probably be of interest to scholars today. The issue, of course, with it is in the current state of cataloguing these materials, it's impossible to know what's where, and what quality of condition scrapbooks or fragments are in, and the organizing of all that material would be a mammoth task, I think, and it would probably involve more than one person working on their own, because there's, as I mentioned, there's lots of these scrapbooks include entries that seem to dot about through Halliwell's working life, and so if one were to create some sort of digital repository of all this, you'd need to map that out, and that would take quite a lot of work. I think it would be very interesting and potentially very useful to scholars, but there's also the fact that much of it may have been superseded by more recent work. Records of early English drama, for example, have hoovered up many of the bits of detail that Halliwell himself has discovered, and there are so it's one of those projects that I think anyone going into it would need to braced for what could be a very long haul effort to recover and work out what these materials are and what they're doing.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Tom. Does anyone have any further comments, observations that they would like to make about Tom's fascinating presentation? There's Helen Vincent commenting, thank you, it's a dream.
Yeah.
We're all allowed to dream with our research, and that's very
A
important.
dream or a nightmare, Helen? That's the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
One person's dream is another person's nightmare.
Yeah.
Okay, on that, can I thank you very much on behalf of Edinburgh Bibliographical Society for your wonderful presentation tonight, and for illuminating a lot of aspects about this Halliwell, this Jekyll and Hyde character, and such an important collection within the University of Edinburgh. So thank you very much. And I see that all the thank yous are coming through the chat bar. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.